Most of you have had the opportunity to visit some of the church historic sites and have felt a special spirit associated with each of them. The Hill Cumorah, the Sacred Grove, the Liberty Jail, and others. The church only lists 24 historic sites on its website, but there are likely hundreds of important sites scattered over the areas of the early church history, and many are unmarked. Well, Tom and I are excited to be asked to take you on a short tour of the one of the most important historic sites in the Mormon pioneer settlement of the Mountain West. We won't need a bus or other vehicle to get there. You were already there when you got up this morning. Your home, your neighbors' homes, and this building are all located on the sacred ground known as Big Cottonwood or Cottonwood. The area that now comprises the Big Cottonwood Stake was part of the pioneer community known as the Big Cottonwood Ward. It was created on February 16, 1849, so the stake bears the same name as the original pioneer settlement. So this place where you live is a sacred historical site. And when someone asks you where you live, we hope you will proudly respond with Big Cottonwood, or the shorter version, Cottonwood. This year is the 170th anniversary of the creation of the community. I think there are just 2 other stakes in the church other than the Salt Lake stake that can claim such longevity, and the Salt Lake stake only beats us by 1 year. A companion ward that was located southwest of us on the Little Cottonwood Creek was named the South Cottonwood Ward. The 2 wards are often referred to as the Cottonwoods, and we think the historians would agree without the Cottonwoods and the resources found in these canyons, the pioneer experiment in this mountain desert would have failed. Not only did Big Cottonwood Ward save the settlement in Salt Lake, it served as the model for over 400 settlements in the Rocky Mountains. Now, let's go back to the subject at hand, the history of this sacred historical site. But we can't understand the importance of this settlement without traveling back in time to see what life was like for the pioneers before they embarked on their journey to the Mountain West. So if you will close your eyes, I will turn on the flux capacitor in our DeLorean so we can travel back in time and find the rest of the story. This is a map of the United States as it existed in 1846, at the time when the Saints were preparing to leave for the Mountain West. Note that Florida and Texas had just been admitted to the Union a year earlier in 1845, and Iowa just a year later. What is now California, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah, and parts of Idaho, Wyoming, and Colorado were all a territory of Mexico. Thus, the first Mormon pioneers actually left the United States when they traveled out to the Salt Lake Valley. The Mexican government ceded all of that territory to the United States in 1848 as a result of the Spanish-American War. The Utah Territory was created in 1849, and California was admitted as a state in 1850. So the Saints were soon back in the United States. However, it was nearly 50 years before they received statehood. The red area of the map represents the states that had been admitted to the Union. But how did the pioneers that had settled in these states travel to their destination? It may surprise you to know that most of the settlers, whether from another state or from abroad, traveled to their new homes on ships that were powered by wind and that traveled on a water highway. That was true for all 13 of the colonies that became the initial United States. Even the settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains were accessed on water highways, and all settlements were made on rivers and other waterways that were close to a port. Some settlements had been made in California, but these settlers too had to reach their destination via a water highway, sailing around the tip of South America into the Pacific Ocean and on to California. Pictured here are Brigham Young and Joseph Smith. The artist entitled this work, Eyes Westward, and the prophets seem to be contemplating something. Could it be they were wondering, in the absence of a water highway, how they can move thousands of pioneers and the many items necessary to sustain life for more than 1,000 miles beyond the frontier? Well, they settled on two means. First, oxen pulling wagons to carry the supplies, equipment, sick, and elderly. And second, what Tom's father used to call Shank's pony, or in today's vernacular, walk. Most of the pioneers walked all the way. Before starting on our 1,000-mile hike, let's look at what living conditions were like for these Mormons were living in where they received the gospel. Most lived in modest but comfortable homes, built of logs and lumber, like the home shown on the left. Note glass windows and curtains that made the home cozy. Some of the families had very nice homes like the one on the right. This is the home of one of Tom's great-grandfathers, John Neff, located in Strasburg, Pennsylvania. It is now on the National Historic Register. Within months after joining the church, John and his wife, Mary, sold everything they owned, including this lovely home and a number of profitable businesses, and gave essentially all they had to the church. It is said that when he died, his estate was worth less than he and his sons had carried in money belts across the plains. There were two other important conditions that existed in all previous settlements in the United States and other places where the converts to the church previously lived. First, rain provided the water for both culinary and irrigation purposes. Second, all previous settlements were made where there was a supply of lumber and other building materials close by. This map shows the average rainfall in the United States. The rainfall in the green area ranged from 30 to 60 inches per year, with an average of 46 inches per year. In a moment, we will talk about what they found in the West, but the important thing to note is that the needs for water and building materials were provided by nature in most places where the early converts came from. So, what did they find when they arrived in the Salt Lake Valley? Well, things looked pretty bleak. Levi Jackman, one of the first pioneers to view the valley, recorded, "On our arrival, we could behold nothing but one vast waste, scarcely a tree or a shrub to be seen." John R. Young later wrote, "From City Creek Canyon, one could see one lone cedar tree on the plain southeast of us, and on the south fork of the creek stood 7 wind-swept, craggly cottonwood trees. On the north side of City Creek stood a large oak tree. No other trees were visible in the valley." After looking out over the desolation that welcomed them, one has to wonder if Brigham Young has been misquoted. He, no doubt, said the words, "This is the place." But could it be that he said those words this way? "This is the place"? The desolation was a matter of great concern, since a good source of water for culinary and irrigation purposes and timber for fuel, fencing, shelter were essential. But that didn't seem to discourage the saints. They were happy that the long journey was over, so they could just roll up their sleeves and get to work. The pioneers were well organized into companies of 10, 50s, and hundreds as they traveled, and that same organization continued after they arrived in the valley. All were immediately given assignments, some to build bricks, others to work on building the fort, others to plow the land and plant the crops, others to explore the valley in hopes of finding needed resources, and others to the many other tasks that were necessary for survival. The first winter, most of the people stayed in the fort, which location is now appropriately named Pioneer Park. Brigham Young had a survey made soon after the first company arrived, and the city was laid out in 10-acre blocks with 8 1 1/4 acre lots on each block. The city was divided into 19 wards, but no land was allocated until the summer of 1848. Each settler received his lot by lottery for $1.50, which was to cover the cost of surveying and recording. The meaning of the word ward is important. These were political subdivisions and were presided over by a bishop. That term is still used in that setting in many parts of the U.S. as well as England. You will recall in the wake of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, the term ward was used when referring to parts of the city. Settlements were needed outside the city in order to harness the resources and build homes and other structures. On February 16, 1849, 4 new wards were created in the Salt Lake Valley, and all were located on streams. The Canyon Ward was located on Parley's Creek. The Mill Creek Ward was located on the stream of the same name. The Big Cottonwood Ward was located on Big Cottonwood Creek, and the South Cottonwood Ward was located on Little Cottonwood Creek. But suitable land and palatable water were not all that was needed to build homes. They needed lumber and other building materials, and there wasn't a single Home Depot in the valley, and they had no iPhones to summon Siri to find one. Well, without lumber or stone, they found their salvation in a very unlikely material. Mud. Would you believe that the material that saved them was mud? They made adobe bricks from a mixture of dirt, clay, water, and straw. There were 2 clay pits in Big Cottonwood. The mixture was scooped into a wooden mold and left a few days until the bricks were firm. They were then removed from the molds and left in the sun to dry, turning them each day until they were solid bricks. Okay, it's time for a quiz. This picture, taken in the 1860s, is one of the Fred Moses home that was located on Walker Lane. Notice that an addition has been made. Can you tell which side was the original building and which side was the addition? The one on the left is the original and was made of adobe bricks. The one on the right was added later when lumber was available. The pioneers found their salvation in the Cottonwoods. First and most important, here they found 3 canyons with streams of clear, cold water. The streams were named Mill Creek, Big Cottonwood Creek, and Little Cottonwood Creek. Because of a large glacial moraine that extended out into the valley, all 3 canyons were accessed through the Cottonwoods. Second, at the mouth of the canyon they found a huge stand of cottonwood trees that fanned out over a large flood plain, one beautiful patch of green in an otherwise desolate valley. The stream had carved a deep channel as it came down the narrow canyon, but as the flow slowed, the channel became wider and more shallow. Each spring, the stream had flooded out over this large plain, making it perfect for growing cottonwood trees. A cottonwood seed must fall on damp soil in order to germinate, and cottonwood trees like to keep their feet wet. So the floodplain created perfect conditions for the cottonwood trees to grow and thrive. This photo is actually the floodplain in Zion's National Park, but it is similar to what the pioneers found in Cottonwood, a wide area fanning out from 4800 south to about 6600 south, and from 3400 east to 1300 east. This is an aerial view of Cottonwood taken recently. If you hike to the top of Mount Olympus in the summer, the view will be much the same as it appeared in pioneer times. Hardly a rooftop can be seen. Cottonwood is the only place left in the entire Salt Lake Valley where that is true. And it is indeed a sacred historical site. But cottonwood trees were not strong or straight enough, nor were there enough to begin to meet the demand for building materials. Fir, pine, and spruce trees were found near the mouth of the canyons, but were high on the mountain sides and few in number. So these trees were harvested by cutting down the trees and then dragging them to a chute where they raced dangerously down the mountainside to the valley floor. The logs were cut into lumber by hand with what were known as pit saws. 2 logs that spanned a pit in the ground and supported a log being cut. 2 men working above and one below used a 2-man whipsaw to cut the log into planks. It was a dirty job for the man below, as the sawdust all fell on him. Big Cottonwood Canyon was initially accessible for only 2 or 3 miles up the canyon. On January 25, 1855, 8 years after the first company of pioneers arrived, Lorenzo Brown and his party traveled to the foot from the end of the road in Big Cottonwood Canyon, and he recorded the following. This canyon, from where we left our wagons, is very narrow and was considered impassable. Of all the places I have ever been in, for mountains, rocks, cataracts, precipices, hills, and hollows, I have never seen the 4 consecutive miles that could compare with this. The canyon is very narrow, but generally filled with timber. The mountains on the east side, which are very high and steep, are densely covered with timber. White fir, pine, and spruce sufficient in sight to keep a mill in operation for 5 years. With the discovery of this vast forest, the pioneers were able to build sawmills in Big Cottonwood Canyon. This was a sawmill that was owned and operated by another of Tom's great-grandfathers, Charles Bagley. The trees were giants and had been growing in the canyon for hundreds of years. The trees were cut and felled on the hillside where they were growing. They were then stripped and cut into sections. The end of each log was hoisted onto a special single-axle wagon and dragged to the sawmill, located on the flat below. The lumber was then conveyed by wagon to a lumber yard in Salt Lake. It took 2 days to transport the lumber from the canyons to the city. The crew overnighted in Cottonwood at grandfather's home that was located on the west side of Highland Drive near what is today's Murray Holiday Road. Another needed building material that had to be harvested in the canyons was granite. Stone was needed to construct a temple and other permanent structures in Salt Lake City, but how could they transport the huge granite stones and the timber some 20 miles to the settlement in Salt Lake City? Well, believe it or not, they decided to build a canal from Big Cottonwood Creek to Salt Lake City. Recall that all previous settlements in the USA had access to water highways, and church leaders were familiar with the speed and low cost of such transportation. Since the canal was to begin in Cottonwood, you might guess who was assigned the task of building the canal. You guessed it, the Big Cottonwood Ward. Following are minutes of the Big Cottonwood Ward on January 7th, 1857. Bishop Brenton said it was the order of the Bishop Hunter that the canal. They built about a mile of the canal and then turned water into it to test the grade. And the ground was so rocky that the water disappeared into the ground. And then they had to build a land highway and construct special wagons to haul the stones and lumber. The land highway constructed to transport the stone was called State Road. It ran from the temple site to about 4900 south along the route of today's State Street. Then southeast along the north side of the Little Cottonwood Creek, now known as Vine Street, east on 6200 south, and then southeast to the mouth of the two canyons. Special reinforced wagons were built to transport the stones. It took 4 days to make a round trip to transport a single stone and then return to the quarry. An overnight campground for the wagon teams was located at Vine Street and 5600 South, where there is a monument located today that includes the wagon pictured here. The route from the canyons was very rough, and there were frequent breakdowns, and the driver had no choice but to drop the stone where the breakdown occurred, because there was no way to reload it. There are many remnants of these stones in the area today, including this bench that is located in the garden of the Irvin T. Nelson family home. The sawmills and other mills were powered by water, so they had to be located on or near a stream. Water wheels were constructed so that a portion of the stream was diverted through a wooden flume, so as to strike the paddles and turn the huge wheel that powered the millstones, saws, or other machinery located inside the buildings. The speed at which the machines turned was regulated by adjusting the amount of water that flowed into the water wheel by raising or lowering the gates at a diversion ditch. The first working grist mill built in the Salt Lake Valley was constructed by Tom's great-grandfather, John Neff. He first obtained a permit to build the mill on the Big Cottonwood Creek, but soon abandoned that plan because there were too many rattlesnakes at that site. Then he moved to Mill Creek and built his mill where 2700 East crosses the stream today. Apparently, there were no rattlesnakes at that location. John had purchased a mill in the east and dismantled it, bringing the machinery with him when he crossed the plains in 1847. This is Knudson's Purling Mill that was located just west of Holiday Boulevard and 6200 South, at the corner appropriately named Knudson's Corner. Great-grandfather Charles Bagley financed the mill, and the water rights of the Bagley Ditch powered the mill. This is the granite paper mill that was used to make paper for the Deseret News and many other publications. And of course it was powered by the Big Cottonwood Creek. On April 1st, 1893, a fire broke out inside the mill. Between its large stockpile of paper and the fact that many who heard the alarm thought it to be an April Fool's joke, the mill was destroyed, leaving only a stone skeleton. The old mill was used as a dance hall in the 1930s and 40s. I don't know how one got a car out if they had to leave early. Tom and I attended dances there in the early 1950s. The great thing about using water to power mills was that it didn't use up any water. After turning the water wheel, the water continued down the stream and could be used for irrigation. That was sort of like having your cake and eating it too. Few people know that the Mormon pioneers were the first of the Anglo-Saxon race to flood irrigate. The Mormon pioneers made good use of this water and dug hundreds of miles of canals and ditches. The Bureau of Reclamation estimated that by 1865, the Mormon pioneers had built diversion dams and dug ditches and canals that transported water to 1.5 million acres of grain and vegetables. Fired with religious zeal and dedication, these pioneers undertook a remarkable transformation of the desert. By 1865, they had constructed 1,000 miles of canals. Education was very important to the residents of the Big Cottonwood Ward. This is one of the first schools in the community and its first teacher, Grandma Moses. It was located on Highland Drive, just north of Spring Lane. The only interior light was from the cracks between the logs. The children brought a hot brick wrapped in a small blanket and held it on their lap to keep warm. Life was especially tough for the Cottonwood pioneers because, in addition to their family and community duties, they had the heavy responsibilities of harvesting and transporting the resources necessary to build the settlement in Salt Lake. To make things worse on these overworked pioneers, their success in learning how to build thriving settlements resulted in many of the leaders being called by Brigham Young to leave their homes and businesses in Cottonwood and move on to form other settlements. John Holliday, for example, lived in Cottonwood less than 3 years before he and other Mississippi Saints were called to go nearly 1,000 miles to form a settlement in San Bernardino, California. John D. Lee, another of the initial settlers in Cottonwood, was also called to move south to lead the settlement for other communities. It is estimated that more than 50 of the initial residents of the Cottonwoods were called to move to help build establishments and other settlements. What was most amazing to me was the faithful manner in which the pioneers accepted the calls to move on. The acid test came to the Big Cottonwood Ward on March 23, 1858. Word came that Johnson's army was approaching, and a special meeting was called by the bishop. The minutes of the meeting follow. Bishop M. Andrews said that the meeting was called to give. Can you imagine the faith of these Big Cottonwood pioneers? They were asked to leave their homes and farms that they had struggled so hard to build and move 200 miles south to start all over again. Not a single hand was raised in opposition. The area that is now the Big Cottonwood Stake has had
The first bishop of the Big Cottonwood Ward was David Brenton, who served for 21 years. His son, David Branson Brenton, who served another 25 years, succeeded him. Thus, the bishop or ad hoc mayor for nearly half a century was addressed as Bishop Brenton.
This is the first ward building that was constructed in what is now the Big Cottonwood Stake and was built in the early 1900s. It was located on today's Highland Drive and Fardown Avenue. It was the first chapel in the church to be constructed entirely by voluntary labor, and it took 15 years to complete it. Prior to completing it, the residents of the community attended sacrament meeting each Sunday evening in the Big Cottonwood Ward building, located in Holidayburg, near where Olympus Junior High is now located. It was common in the pioneer era to have branch Sunday schools in rural areas because of the difficulty in traveling. Accordingly, In the early years, the saints in this community held their Sunday school meetings each Sunday morning in the schoolhouse here in Cottonwood. They also held a separate Sunday school in Danish in the community for the Scandinavians who lived on Danish Lane, known today as Fardown Avenue. This building is typical of ward houses, as they were called, that were built prior to World War II. Notice the outside stairs. The building consisted of 2 floors. The basement was located down 1/3 of a flight of stairs. It contained one large room called the Junior Sunday School Room, a half-dozen small classrooms, a kitchen, and 2 small restrooms. The second floor was up 2/3 a flight of stairs and included the chapel, a small bishop's office, and a half-size gym with a stage, today called the Cultural Hall. This is the building where Tom and I attended church until 1958. There were lots of small streams called spring runs and a number of small lakes or ponds in Cottonwood. This photo is where our big Cottonwood Stake Center and Spring Lane Elementary School are now located. This is Shady Lake that was located just south and east of the Stake Center Pavilion. This photo is of James and Alice Moyle boating on the lake at Lakewood Farm, where the Cottonwood Club is now located. This photo is of the Nelson boys boating on the same lake in 1941. The skinny runt on the left is Tommy, or the adult known as A. Tom Nelson. This is the E.C. and Amanda Bagley home, located at 5601 Highland Drive, currently the Frio home. Amanda Bagley, founder of the Cottonwood Maternity Hospital, is dressed in white between the trees. This is the Bagley Meat and Grocery that was located on what is now the northeast corner of Pheasant Circle and Highland Drive. The area has also been part of 6 stakes: the Salt Lake Stake, the Granite Stake, the Cottonwood Stake, the Big Cottonwood Stake, the Cottonwood Stake again, the Big Cottonwood Stake again. The Big Cottonwood Ward was part of the Salt Lake Stake until 1900. Initially, the stake offices were housed in this building, the 19th Ward. Prior to the division of the Salt Lake Stake, it consisted of 51 wards. It was customary for stakes outside the Salt Lake Valley to have a stake tabernacle, so when the Granite Stake was organized in 1900, this tabernacle was built at 33rd South and State Street. The chief purpose was to provide a meeting place for quarterly stake conference and other stake gatherings. In most cases, a general authority presided at each stake conference. For the first 50 years of the church, most baptisms were done in lakes, ponds, and streams. That was a real test of faith for those who were baptized in the winter. If you check for baptismal dates for children in those early days, you will often find they were not baptized in the month of their birth, especially if the birth date was in December or January. But even in the summertime, the water was very cold as it flowed from a mountain stream, and the children, at least, longed for an indoor site. Well, that is where the stake tabernacles came to the rescue, as most of them were equipped with a baptismal font. Probably the first indoor font was located in the basement of the Salt Lake Tabernacle, completed in 1867. That must have been the only one in the Salt Lake Valley until sometime after the Second World War, since both Tom and I were baptized there. The sacrament is another ordinance that has seen many changes over time. Of course, we are all aware that the water was substituted for wine in the very early days of the Restoration. A less well known fact is that for many years a two handled sacrament cup was used, and all took a sip from the same cup. Another point of interest is that the sacrament was passed 3 times each Sunday: Senior Sunday School, Junior Sunday School, and Sacrament Meeting. The sacrament was also passed at each quarterly stake conference, and likewise passed in the ward in the evening following the closing session of General Conference. This continued, at least in this community, until the present block meeting schedule was adopted in 1979. By the way, President Pinnock's father was one of the general authorities that developed the block meeting schedule. When the granite stake was divided, this building became the Joint Granite Stake Cottonwood Stake Tabernacle. There are still a few stake tabernacles standing, for example in Logan and Brigham City, and 2 have been converted into temples in Provo and Vernal.
In 1900, the Salt Lake Stake, with 59 wards, was divided and the Big Cottonwood ward became part of the Granite Stake. Frank Y. Taylor, son of the 3rd president of the church, John Taylor, was the first president of the Granite Stake. He served 28 years in that capacity, 14 years while our area was part of the stake. 2 important programs are attributed to his administration, both concerned with family closeness.
First home evenings in the church were started in the Granite Stake. They were first held on Tuesdays, later on Mondays. A stake committee prepared a booklet suggesting a format that included prayer, singing, instrumental music, scripture reading, and gospel instruction. The second important thing that occurred while we were part of the Granite Stake was establishing the first seminary in the church at Granite High. James E. Moss served as the first principal of both the high school and the seminary. Today, the seminary and institute programs teach over 700,000 students in 143 countries.
The Granite Stake was divided in 1914, and the new Cottonwood Stake was created. It was presided over by Uriah G. Miller, who served from 1914 to 1923. This was a difficult time in history with the World War I and the worst influenza pandemic in history that left no place in the world untouched. All the time there were no hospitals available in the most rural areas, and many newborns died within the first few months of life, and often mothers lost their lives due to complications from childbirth. That is when these grand ladies came to the rescue and accomplished miracles that are still impacting our lives today. Amanda Neff Bagley served as the first Relief Society president of the Cottonwood Stake. Mary S. Cornwall and Rena D. Wheeler served as counselors. The Cottonwood Stake extended from 39th South to 70th South and from the Ochre Mountains on the west to Brighton on the east. The Relief Society's sisters served as volunteer nurses, and licensed doctors were able to use the facilities without a charge. The Deseret News reported at the 10th anniversary of the facility that 1,000 babies had been born without a single life of a mother or child lost. The Cottonwood Maternity Home became the Cottonwood Hospital, and the Cottonwood Hospital later became the Intermountain Medical Center. Henry D. Moyle, a member of the Cottonwood Ward, was called to be the stake president of the Cottonwood Stake and served from 1929 to 1937. Although President Moyle did not serve as the president of the Big Cottonwood Stake, he did serve as stake president of the stake that included the historic Big Cottonwood Ward. So his portrait appropriately hangs in the stake office of the Big Cottonwood Stake. President Moyle was instrumental in creating the church welfare program and became an apostle and a member of the first presidency. In 1940, the Cottonwood Stake was divided, creating the Big Cottonwood Stake. Irvin T. Nelson was sustained as the president of the new stake. It was the 133rd in the church, and President Nelson served until 1949.
The country was still in a depression when the stake was organized, so funds were carefully rationed. Accordingly, a small wing was attached to the back of the Cottonwood Ward building to serve as the stake office.
Under President Nelson's direction, the stake engaged in its first welfare project, a 10-acre, 800-tree fruit orchard. The first crop of peaches was harvested in 1946, with apricots, apples, plums, and pears the following year. All of this was made possible by enlisting the less active members and having them work side by side with active members. On May 8, 1949, the Cottonwood Ward was divided and the Big Cottonwood Ward was created. Instead of following the common practice of calling an experienced high priest to serve as bishop, President Nelson was inspired to call a young returned missionary as bishop of the new ward. His name was James E. Faust, and he called other young men to assist him, particularly in leading the young men of the church. One of these Aaronic priesthood leaders learned that the church had no monument honoring John the Baptist, who was instrumental in restoring the Aaronic priesthood. The boys in the ward, under the direction of one of these leaders, undertook a project selling manure to fertilize lawns and accumulated $100. The bishop sent a check to the presiding bishop of the church, asking him to accept the offering, and suggested he ask all Aaronic priesthood bearers in the church to contribute to the cause. The presiding bishop did that, and in October of 1958, a monument was erected on Temple Square.
Several years later, a duplicate was erected on the banks of the Susquehanna River, near the actual site of the first baptisms of this dispensation. The Big Cottonwood Stake was divided in 1956, and two new stakes were created, the Holiday Stake and the Cottonwood Stake. In doing so, the Cottonwood Stake, having been discontinued in 1940, was resurrected. This building was built as the Cottonwood 2nd and 4th Wards and Cottonwood Stake Building. It now houses Cottonwood 2nd and 14th Wards.
James E. Faust was sustained as the president of the resurrected Cottonwood Stake in 1956 and served in that capacity until 1968. Like President Moyle, President Faust did not serve as president of the Big Cottonwood Stake, but lived in the historic boundaries of what is now the Big Cottonwood Stake, so his portrait also appropriately hangs in the stake office. It is interesting that both Henry D. Moyle and James E. Faust were later called as apostles, and all of them also served in the first presidency.
The Cottonwood Stake was divided in 1972, recreating the Big Cottonwood Stake, and the other stake retained the Cottonwood name. Two new stake centers were built, with this building becoming the home of the Big Cottonwood Stake. Robert Barker was the first president of the resurrected Big Cottonwood Stake, serving from 1972 to 1981.
It is interesting to note that the boundaries of our current Big Cottonwood Steak are exactly the same as the boundaries of the Big Cottonwood Ward when it was recreated in 1949.
Craig T. Vincent served as the Big Cottonwood Steak president from 1981 to 1990. Carrie M. Hines served as president from 1990 to 1999. Ellis R. Ivory served as president of the steak from 1999 to 2008. Alan Brinkerhoff served as president from 2008 to 2018. And of course, Matthew McConkey was recently sustained as stake president and has a few years ahead of him in that capacity.